Hello all, thank you for being here. My name is Bharat, and what I did for my capstone was coming up with a rapid appraisal methodology to determine employment opportunity areas in African cities, case study of Kampala, Nairobi and Dakar. And I know everybody is thinking at this time this is the longest title of all the capstones. It's not, it's actually Shriti Ghosh's capstone that has a longer title than mine. So what I'm doing with this capstone is about the access of people, goods, services and information being essential to economic activity in any city, or the economic vitality of any city. When you look at the more efficient the access to these elements are, the more efficient a city is, the more value it provides to the human condition within those cities. So my study was basically about how to assess accessibility. So before that, we have to look at what is accessibility and what is mobility and what am I talking about. In any city, when you're looking at planning a city, you're looking at two things: land use and transportation. Where the activities are, where people live, and how they get to one point to the other. Traditionally, most cities look at mobility. How fast and how efficiently can you get from point A to point B? And this has been the norm for almost half a century or even longer. The result of that is Los Angeles. You have a whole bunch of freeways and a whole bunch of congestion. So we now know that that's not the best way to look at it. So we have trained our ways to look at it differently, which is accessibility. Accessibility is basically looking at mobility in terms of, are you creating better access for citizens to opportunities through adoption of land use policies and transportation investment. So this idea has gained a lot of traction in the last couple of decades, and the World Bank looks at this as a viable tool to be able to assess accessibility in several parts of the world. One of the challenges that they face in globalizing this approach is data. Where are the jobs located? So over here in the US, it's very easy. You go to the department, you go to the IRS, you go to the Department of Commerce, and they will have a lot of data that's available simply because most of the jobs are formal, there is a record. In Africa, that's not the case. African cities lack that kind of data. Almost 80 to 90% of employment is informal. If there is data collection, it's outdated or is only recording formal data. So there is a huge challenge for the World Bank to globalize this work on accessibility because they don't have any data. So the project goal was basically to identify methods, data sets that are readily available that can predict the location of employment opportunity areas. And again, I wanted to emphasize on the word location. I'm not here to estimate how many jobs are at a location. I'm here to estimate where is the highest density of jobs, or where will be the highest concentration of jobs. So the whole idea was to come up with a methodology, and then if that methodology is scalable across cities of Africa. So I relied on the geographic characteristics of employment. We all know economic clustering happens due to physical, geographic and transportation characteristics, and it was part of David Zilberman's class, if you all remember. The other study that I looked at was in terms of, okay, that's a fact, jobs cluster, but do formal jobs and informal jobs cluster together because Africa has a lot of informal jobs, so I need to capture that. So there are several studies that show that they exist alongside, in fact, feed off each other. So that issue was also put aside, saying that, okay, if I do find economic clusters, I can safely say that they have a significant share of informal jobs in there. And then lastly, economic clusters themselves change the characteristics of the space. If you need more connectivity and there is limited connectivity, you will build up, because then you have more flows so that people are together and they can address. So basically I went through looking at data sources. I selected crowdsourcing because that's the easiest, OpenStreetMap and Google Earth. I looked at key indicators that I picked. These are points of interest. If you looked at your Google Maps, you can see all those small points out there of businesses and restaurants. Then I looked at proximity of Main Street intersections, how close intersections are to a particular location, because connectivity is an essential part of economic activity. And lastly was the proximity of informal taxi ranks and minibus stages to those areas, because again, people need to go there. Africa doesn't have good transportation, so there are these informal services that are available and you can identify those. I looked at, so the methodology was basically comparing actual employment distribution to what I derived out of these indicators. And the reason why we picked Kampala, Dakar, and Nairobi is simply that we had this data. I did several statistical tests. These are correlation, CHOW tests, mapping residuals, and spatial autocorrelation. And the results basically were, the correlation scores were pretty high, which is very interesting. And the CHOW test, which again I will not get into, it basically tells you if the coefficients are the same. They weren't, but it didn't matter because they all sort of work in the same way. And then the residual mapping, which again I will skip, basically tells us where it's stopping short or where it's being accurate. And then lastly was the spatial autocorrelation, just to see if anything based on geography or location was determining the employment clusters and not just the indicators. So in conclusion, the indicators work across the cities. You can't really standardize the coefficients that were used. Crowdsourcing data can work even with very low volumes. The ratio of population to amenities was 0.05, which is really low. And lastly, the methodology can be applied for rapid appraisals, but if you want to go into more detail, you probably can add more elements from crowdsourced data, which I used over the summer and were successful. But for this case, I wanted to use just the bare minimum and see if we could get, where can we get with that. So with that, I end my talk. Thank you. Yes?
I was wondering what would be some of the policy implication of what you found?
So the main policy implication is there are several aspects of it. First of all, this is a World Bank task. They need to know, they need to do this very quickly and often so that they can provide information to their clients, which are African cities, so that they have something that's very standard and then they can apply that. The second, obviously, is the policy implication is in terms of data gathering. And it's a costly affair. Expecting African nations or African cities to do census data and collect all of this information is a daunting task when they have so much other issues to deal with. So there is other studies that have used the same crowdsourced data to predict high-level accuracy, to get high-level accuracy of population distribution. So there's no reason why this methodology, if built upon, you can actually have this as an alternative, a solid alternative to actual survey data that you do for economic activity. I bored everybody to death, I know that.
I was wondering if you work with a team or do some interviews or like how was?
This was primarily a sitting in a cubicle trying to figure it out issue, and that is the shortcoming of it. And that is why I wanted to rely on crowdsourced data, because when you're looking at crowdsourced data, that's the investment of the community. They are putting that data up, and it is live. You can always update your information, unlike, say, cell phone data or smartphone data, which is so hard to get. There's all sorts of legal issues, and you would probably have to take a year to figure out just to get a phone number in Google to tell you that, oh yes, you can talk to us now. So, and again, if you look at remote sensing, which has been a big thing, satellite imagery, and there's a lot of research done on night lights and trying to figure out on that how, where the urban boundaries are or what are the different economic activities. The accuracy level for that is not as high, and it needs a lot of cleaning up. It's very technical, so considering an economist or an urban planner, to do that is not going to happen. So, and then obviously the last one is government data, which we know that is not available. So that's basically the intent of the study. Yes, Dave?
If you try to use this technique for some economic activity for yourself in the future?
I mean, for predicting the future?
Yeah, no, do you see yourself starting firm or?
Oh, it's a good idea. I have to, what I'm doing...
Just prepare stuff to say.
Well, the ultimate goal of the capstone was actually writing a research paper and trying to publish it. So once I get that moving forward, there's definitely an opportunity to do that. I haven't really thought about it because I'm way too busy actually having a daytime job as well, so I haven't really thought about it, but yeah, that is something that I would definitely think about. Sam?
Yeah. Did you notice anything interesting in these cities?
Of course, there is some very different, the first limitation that I have to mention is OpenStreetMap data is crowdsourced. So when you look at Kenya's OpenStreetMap, there's a whole bunch of activity that has happened in the slums of Kenya to map your surroundings. So a lot of that data got in and skewed the data because it's all about those communities and you're not having the same level of input from outside the slums. So you have to be very cognizant of that. You have to look at the data set at first glance and say, is this missing something here? So you have to be very careful of that. So for Nairobi, I had to pick Google because that's more curated by Google, and that was fairly more evenly distributed as you would expect it to be. So there are those pitfalls that you have to be very careful about. You just can't do it at random, and you have to look at that from a perspective of an urban planner or an urban economist to see and look at that and where that makes sense.
So what would you say would the aggregate accuracy of the pinpoint?
Aggregate accuracy, I tried it on 3 cities with all sorts of data, and I actually, initially when I did it on the sort of the score of the city, of the metropolitan area for Kampala. I had an accuracy rate of 80%, which is pretty good. But when you expand it outwards, it dropped to 66%. And part of this, is the nuances of how they map employment data. So I don't know if you guys you guys obviously don't know anything about traffic analysis zones. So what it is it's based off on a geography of a number of jobs. A traffic analysis zone has to have a minimum number of jobs. So basically, if you get a minimum number of jobs in downtown, the traffic analysis zone is much smaller. While if you're in the boondocks, the traffic analysis zone will be much bigger. So it diffuses the number of jobs across that. So I was running into some issues with that as well as you get out of...
Which makes sense, right? Because even high-tech data on an aggregate is only 66%
Yes.
accurate.
So we are getting that, but I was at, for Dakar and Nairobi, it was over 70%. And if you add in a few more layers that are easily available, but I didn't use them simply because I wanted to just do a bare minimum, it can go up. So if you add in land use, it will definitely go up.